Every fall, Blackwood Packing House dumped tons of bruised apples behind a rusted fence and called them worthless. Evelyn Harper, 67, had spent 40 years being known only as Thomas Harper's wife, the woman who cooked, cleaned, balanced the household bills, and quietly held everything together. Then she found a bank notice hidden inside her husband's desk. Their orchard would be seized in December. Worse, the weight listed on Blackwood's payment records did not match the amount of fruit Thomas had delivered. But apples were not the only thing Blackwood had stolen. Then Thomas collapsed in the orchard, leaving Evelyn alone to face 55 acres of apple trees, a mountain of debt, and Moses, an aging German shepherd who refused to leave her side. With no business degree, no factory, and nothing but an old family recipe book, what could Evelyn possibly do? Every life carries a story, and every one of us deserves a place to share what lies within our hearts. You are here with Porchlight Stories, where every life is welcomed beneath the warm glow of the porch light. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story. Please stay with us until the very end. If today's story touches your heart, give the video a like and subscribe to support the channel. And if there is anything we could do better, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. And now, let's begin. Late August had come warm and windless to Cedar Hollow, Michigan. At 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, the sky above Harper Orchard was pale gray blue, and a thin mist rested between the rows of gala trees. The first apples of the season glowed red and gold beneath the leaves, while cicadas sang from the fence line. Evelyn Harper stood beside the loading wagon with a clipboard tucked against her faded blue cardigan. At 67, she was a small white woman, barely 5'3", with silver hair twisted into a low bun and hazel eyes that missed very little. For more than 40 years, Evelyn had cooked, cleaned, kept the household accounts, preserved fruit, and organized church suppers. People called her kind. Few called her capable, because most of what she did happened before anyone thought to notice. Her husband Thomas tightened the straps over the first truckload. He was 71, broad-shouldered despite the bend age had placed in his back, with iron gray hair, weathered skin, and hands thickened by pruning shears and winter cold. Thomas worked methodically, spoke carefully, and disliked owing anyone anything. His father had nearly lost the orchard during the recession of the early 1980s, and Thomas had spent the rest of his life treating caution as a kind of religion. At his heels moved Moses, their 9-year-old German shepherd. Moses had a black and tan coat, a silvering muzzle, a slightly drooping left ear, and a pale scar along his right flank from old barbed wire. Evelyn had named him after Thomas found him as an abandoned puppy tangled in cattails beside the irrigation pond. "Drawn out of the water," she had joked. Moses was not trained for any heroic purpose. He simply understood when either of them needed silent company. "You counted 32 bins?" Thomas asked. "Twice," Evelyn replied. "You counted 31. Thomas checked her clipboard. "Then I missed one." "That happens when a man refuses breakfast." "I had coffee." "Coffee is not breakfast." A reluctant smile crossed his face. They left shortly after 7. The road to Blackwood Packing House ran 8 miles through rolling farmland, past white barns, soybean fields, and roadside stands. Thomas drove the old Ford flatbed. Evelyn sat beside him, and Moses rested his chin between their seats. Blackwood Packing House stood on the southern edge of Cedar Hollow, a long metal building surrounded by loading docks, forklifts, and refrigerated trailers. The air smelled of diesel, wet wood, and ripe fruit. Inside, conveyor belts rattled beneath fluorescent lights as apples rolled past workers in gloves. A foreman named Earl Benton directed their truck towards Scale 3. Earl was a lean man in his early 60s, with a sunken face, a red cap, and the hurried politeness of someone who had spent decades answering to impatient owners. He greeted Thomas by name and checked the load sheet. The gala apples disappeared into the receiving line. Evelyn watched workers separate them by size and appearance. The cleanest fruit moved toward padded boxes stamped for grocery chains in Grand Rapids and Chicago. Slightly smaller apples went into another channel. Then she noticed the rejected bins. Dozens of bushels sat near the rear wall, filled with apples that were crooked, lightly bruised, scratched by branches, or split near the stem. A forklift dumped another load into the pile. Several apples rolled across the concrete and stopped near Evelyn's shoes. She picked one up. Its skin carried a shallow scar, but the flesh beneath her thumb was firm. It smelled sweet and sharp, exactly as a ripe gala should. "What happens to these?" she asked Earl. "Some go for feed, some get hauled away." "They could be pressed." Earl glanced toward the office above the grating floor. "That decision isn't mine." Curtis Blackwood came down the metal stairs. At 56, Curtis was a tall, well-fed white man with neatly combed sandy gray hair, a trimmed mustache, and a Navy Company polo that never seemed to wrinkle. He had inherited the packing house from his father and expanded it into the county's largest buyer. Curtis was rarely openly cruel. He preferred making people feel childish for questioning him. "Mrs. Harper," he said warmly, "first load of the season." Evelyn held up the scarred apple. "There's nothing wrong with this. Cosmetically there is. I mean inside." Curtis folded his arms. "Grocery customers buy with their eyes. We don't make the standards. Then why not turn them into juice or sauce?" His smile became patient and almost fatherly. "Processing is more complicated than it looks from a kitchen. Liability, equipment, licensing, distribution. There are reasons the industry works this way." "A kitchen can be complicated too." Thomas touched her elbow. "Evie." Curtis continued smiling. "I'm sure it can. But commercial decisions are best left to people who understand the market. Waste is unfortunate, but it is part of agriculture." Behind him, a forklift carried another bin of rejected apples toward the outside lot. Evelyn looked at Thomas, expecting him to say she had asked a reasonable question. Instead, he lowered his gaze toward the paperwork. "We should get back," he murmured. Curtis shook Thomas's hand and began discussing harvest schedules as though Evelyn had already left. The ride home was quiet. By late morning, the mist had burned away, and the temperature climbed toward 84 degrees. Heat shimmered above the road. A mile from the orchard, Thomas loosened his grip on the steering wheel and drew a careful breath. "Pull over," Evelyn said. "I'm fine." "You're pale." Thomas guided the truck onto the gravel shoulder. When he stepped out, he leaned one hand against the hood, breathing too quickly. Moses jumped down and pressed against his leg, staring up at him with dark, worried eyes. "It's the heat," Thomas said. "You were inside most of the morning." "I didn't sleep well." Evelyn wanted to insist that they visit a doctor, but Thomas straightened and gave her the expression he used when a subject was closed. His pride had carried him through droughts, frost, debt, and the death of both his parents. It had also taught him to treat pain like an unpaid bill, something best hidden until he could manage it alone. Moses remained close to him for the rest of the drive. By evening, Thomas seemed better. He ate little, blamed the weather, and went to bed early. Moses settled on the rug beside him instead of following Evelyn to the kitchen. Near midnight, Evelyn remembered the heartburn tablets Thomas kept in the desk. She opened the bottom drawer and found a white envelope beneath the farm insurance papers. "Final notice" was printed across the top. For a moment she thought she had opened someone else's mail. Then she saw Thomas's name, the Harper Orchard account number, and the date printed 3 months earlier. The bank required $40,000 by December 1st. If payment was not made, foreclosure proceedings would begin against the 18-acre south parcel. Evelyn knew that land well. It contained some of the oldest trees in the orchard, including the row Thomas's father had planted in 1967. It also bordered the county road. Once sold, it would likely become housing lots, and the orchard would never be whole again. Attached documents listed 2 frost-damaged seasons, an emergency loan used to replace part of the irrigation system, and declining orchard income over 3 years. Thomas had known for months. Evelyn sat at the desk, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. She thought of every time he had told her not to worry, every meal during which he had pretended to be tired rather than frightened, and every night he had remained at the kitchen table after she went to bed. Beneath the notice lay a delivery ticket from Blackwood Packing House. Gross accepted weight, 18,600 pounds. Clipped behind it was the monthly payment statement. Paid weight, 16,940 pounds. Evelyn read the figures twice. Then she subtracted them on the back of an old church envelope, although she already knew the difference. 1,660 pounds. She searched through the papers for an explanation. There was no spoilage deduction, no revised grading report, no transportation adjustment, no note saying that part of the load had been rejected. Only missing apples. Moses entered the room and rested his chin on her knee. Evelyn placed one hand on his silvered head. His ears shifted toward the bedroom, listening for Thomas, but he remained beside her. Evelyn had spent 40 years stretching grocery money, tracking household expenses, and making certain every jar in the cellar was labeled with its contents and date. Numbers did not frighten her. Waste did. Nearly 1,700 pounds was not a rounding error. It was dozens of bushels. It was days of pruning, spraying, thinning, picking, and hauling. It was part of the harvest Thomas believed he had been paid for. She stared at the bank notice and the two conflicting records until the numbers seemed less like ink and more like footprints leading somewhere dark. Perhaps frost had damaged their income. Perhaps the irrigation failure had deepened the debt, but weather did not alter figures after a truck crossed a scale. Had the seasons truly buried the Harper family? Or had someone been taking pieces of their harvest for years, trusting that Thomas would never risk his contract by asking questions? Evelyn folded the bank notice carefully and placed the delivery ticket beside it. Nearly 1,700 pounds of apples had entered Blackwood Packing House. Where had they gone? Morning came to Harper Orchard beneath a low ceiling of clouds. Evelyn had not slept. The bank notice, delivery ticket, and payment statement lay across the kitchen table when Thomas entered shortly after 6. He wore yesterday's brown work shirt, one sleeve buttoned wrong, and the gray beneath his eyes made him look older than 71. Moses followed him, then paused between them as if he sensed danger. Thomas saw the papers and stopped. Evelyn asked how long he had known. He admitted the bank had first warned him in May. 2 late frosts had reduced the crop, the irrigation pump had failed the previous summer, and replacement pipes had cost more than expected. Blackwood's payments had also declined for 3 years, but Thomas had believed one strong harvest would repair everything. "I was trying to keep it from becoming your burden," he said. Evelyn replied that a hidden burden did not become lighter. It only became lonelier. When she pointed to the missing 1,660 pounds, Thomas called it a likely clerical adjustment, moisture loss, grading, or rejected bins. She asked whether Blackwood had explained it. He said no. She asked whether he had demanded an explanation. Thomas looked toward the window. Blackwood bought nearly 3/4 of their marketable crop. Challenging Curtis could cost them the only contract large enough to move thousands of bushels before the fruit softened. "An unpaid apple is bad," he said. "An orchard with no buyer is worse." Evelyn did not continue the argument. After breakfast, she carried empty canning boxes into the cellar beneath the farmhouse. The narrow stairs creaked, and the air smelled of stone, dust, and last year's preserves. Shelves held jars of beans, tomatoes, cherries, and applesauce, each labeled in Evelyn's exact handwriting. Behind folded feed sacks, she found a cedar chest she had not opened since Thomas's mother died. Margaret Harper had been a tall, square-shouldered woman with bright blue eyes and white hair worn in a crown of braids. In a photograph inside the chest, she stood beside a roadside table in 1948, holding a jar of dark apple butter. Margaret had survived the lean years after the war by treating thrift as a form of defiance. Beneath the photograph lay a blue cloth-bound notebook, its pages stained with cinnamon and sugar. It contained recipes for sweet cider, spiced apple butter, vinegar starter, dried apple rings, and pie filling. More important were the notes in the margins. Use bruised fruit first. Reject mold, not ugliness. Wash twice after sorting. Keep pressed juice cold. Record every batch. On one page, Margaret had written, "A bad-looking apple can still feed a family. Pride cannot." The notebook did not offer a miracle. It offered a method. Apples rejected for their appearance could not survive a week on a grocery shelf, but cider did not need flawless skin. Apple butter did not care whether fruit had grown crooked. Upstairs, Evelyn spread Margaret's notebook beside her household ledgers and began making columns. Bottles, jars, lids, sugar, spices, electricity, fuel, and labels. She knew how many servings came from a bushel because she had organized church suppers for 200 people. She understood spoilage because she had preserved fruit since she was 16. For decades, people had called those things homemaking. On paper, they looked like inventory control, production planning, and cost management. What Evelyn did not know were the legal requirements, so she called the county extension office. The next morning, she met Dr. Hannah Reed at a brick building beside the fairgrounds. Hannah was 43, tall and narrow-faced, with short auburn hair, rectangular glasses, and the brisk manner of someone who corrected dangerous assumptions without humiliating people. The daughter of a dairy farmer who had lost his herd after a contamination scare, Hannah had built her career around helping small producers understand that food safety was not meaningless paperwork. Hannah respected Margaret's notebook but drew a firm line between family tradition and commercial production. Lightly bruised or scratched apples could be processed, she explained, but moldy, deeply rotten, or contaminated fruit had to be discarded. Every batch required documented sourcing, sorting, washing, sanitation, temperature control, and proper labeling. Sweet cider needed safe treatment before sale. A home kitchen would not support the volume Evelyn imagined, but the old equipment shed might work if it had washable surfaces, safe water, pest control, drainage, and separate storage. "You are not selling a memory," Hannah said. "You are selling food to people who trust you." Evelyn answered, "Then I intend to deserve that trust." Over the following week, Evelyn completed an online food safety course at the dining room table. She scored 98% and was irritated by the 2 questions she missed. She calculated the cost of a 16-ounce bottle of sweet cider, then ran the figures again with higher expenses and lower sales. Thomas watched the papers multiply but remained unconvinced. They owed $40,000, he reminded her, not 40. A roadside operation could consume their savings and still leave the orchard exposed. Evelyn replied that doing nothing already had a price, and they saw it every time Blackwood rejected a bin. Their argument lasted through supper. At last, Thomas offered a boundary rather than approval. Evelyn could use the old equipment shed behind the south barn and the rejected fruit from 3 acres near Miller Creek, where the sandy soil dried quickly and the apples scarred easily. She could spend only her personal savings from sewing, church catering, and holiday preserves. She could not borrow against the farm. If the project lost money, it would end after the trial. Evelyn held out her hand. Thomas stared at it, then shook it. The gesture was formal and almost businesslike. For the first time in their marriage, that pleased her. Evelyn found a used belt press at a closed orchard outside Traverse City. It was older than the advertisement suggested, but its 60-gallon tank was intact, and the price left enough money for bottles and repairs. 2 days later, a heavy-set driver with a shaved head lowered it into the equipment shed and assured her it had worked fine last fall. Up close, dried apple pulp clung beneath one guard, the belt felt stiff, and the motor casing was scratched. Thomas plugged in the machine and pressed the switch. The motor gave one dull click and died. Thomas removed the guard and tried to turn the shaft by hand. It did not move. When he stood, his face went pale, and he gripped the workbench until the dizziness passed. Moses pressed against his knee. Thomas waved away Evelyn's concern and looked back at the machine. "The shaft is seized," he said. "It could be the bearings. It could be worse." Before Evelyn could answer, the weather radio crackled. A slow-moving storm system was expected to reach Cedar Hollow within 48 hours. After weeks of dry heat, the forecast called for nearly 3 inches of rain. The sudden moisture could swell the gala apples faster than their skins could stretch, splitting thousands across the 3 acres Thomas had given her. Evelyn looked from Margaret's notebook to the silent press, then toward dark clouds gathering beyond the orchard. Her first real supply of rejected apples was coming, and she had only 2 days to make the broken machine work. By 7 the next morning, the storm clouds had thickened above Cedar Hollow, turning the late August sky the color of old iron. The air felt heavy enough to hold in the hand, and the orchard leaves had gone still. Inside the equipment shed, Thomas Harper knelt beside the silent cider press with a wrench in one hand and a flashlight between his teeth. Though he had agreed only to give Evelyn room for a trial, he could not sit at the farmhouse and watch her struggle with machinery neither of them fully understood. He removed the metal guard, loosened the belt, and found rust gathered around the main bearing. The machine had likely been washed before storage, but never dried properly. Moisture had reached the shaft and locked it in place. Evelyn held the work light while Thomas sprayed penetrating oil into the housing and tapped the corroded metal with a rubber mallet. "The man said it worked last fall," she reminded him. Thomas pulled the flashlight from his mouth. People become poets when they sell used equipment. Under different circumstances, Evelyn might have laughed. Instead, she watched him rise too quickly, sway, and grab the edge of the workbench. The color drained from his face. Moses, who had been lying beside the open shed door, stood immediately and crossed the floor. The German shepherd pressed his broad shoulder against Thomas's leg and rested his silvered muzzle on the old man's knee when Thomas sat down. "You are going to a doctor," Evelyn said. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead, though the morning was not yet hot. "After harvest." "That is what you said yesterday." "And harvest is still not finished." Moses stared at him without blinking. Thomas scratched the dog's bent left ear and muttered, "Don't recruit him against me." Before Evelyn could answer, a car horn sounded from the yard. June Callahan emerged from a faded green Buick, carrying 3 cardboard boxes and a pie. At 69, June was a round, energetic widow with short white curls, bright pink glasses, and the ability to speak through almost any task without losing her breath. Her husband had died 6 years earlier after a long illness, and silence had frightened her ever since. She filled it with jokes, gossip, hymns, and unsolicited advice. Behind her came Mabel Ortiz in a dark red pickup. Mabel was 64, broad-shouldered and calm with warm brown skin, cropped gray hair, and strong hands marked by 30 years in a public school kitchen. She spoke less than June, but when she did, people generally stopped what they were doing and listened. Evelyn had mentioned the project after Sunday service. She had expected encouragement. She had not expected them to arrive with bottle brushes, rubber gloves, thermometers, folding tables, and enough determination to invade a small country. "You cannot start a food business with 1 sink and a prayer," Mabel said as she entered the shed. June placed the pie on the bench. "The prayer helps. The pie is for morale." Thomas looked at the 3 women, then at the machine. "I appear to have lost control of my own building." "Only temporarily," Evelyn told him. They worked through the morning. Thomas freed the shaft after replacing the worst bearing with one salvaged from an unused conveyor in the barn. Mabel scrubbed and sanitized every food contact surface, then arranged the shed into separate areas for incoming fruit, washing, pressing, heating, bottling, and finished goods. June washed the first shipment of glass bottles while narrating the entire history of every family living along County Road 8. Evelyn followed Hannah Reed's instructions precisely, taping written sanitation procedures beside the sink and setting up a batch log at the clean table. Shortly after noon, Thomas replaced a cracked motor capacitor. When he pressed the switch, the motor groaned, the belt shuddered, and the press began to turn. June raised both hands and shouted as if they had won a football championship. Outside, the first drop of rain struck the metal roof. The storm arrived with remarkable force. For nearly 11 hours, rain hammered the orchard, flooded the drainage ditch, and turned the lower rows near Miller Creek into dark mud. Lightning flashed beyond the barn, and wind threw small branches across the yard. By dawn, the rain gauge showed almost 3 inches. Evelyn walked the 3-acre trial block with Thomas and Moses beneath a clearing sky. The apples looked beautiful from a distance, washed clean and shining beneath the leaves. Up close, hundreds had split near the stem. The fruit had swollen too quickly after weeks of dry weather. Some cracks were small and fresh. Others opened deeply enough to expose pale flesh. Thomas lifted one apple, examined it, and let it fall into the grass. "Blackwood won't take these." By 8, Earl Benton confirmed it over the phone. The packing house would reject the entire section because split fruit could deteriorate during storage and transport. Thomas accepted the decision with the tired resignation of a man hearing familiar bad news. Evelyn did not. She retrieved their contract from the farmhouse and read every paragraph at the kitchen table. The document stated that Blackwood controlled fruit only after formal acceptance at receiving. Rejected fruit remained the grower's property. There was no clause preventing the Harpers from processing apples that Blackwood refused. When Evelyn showed Thomas, he read the paragraph twice. "Curtis won't like it." "Curtis does not have to drink it." Thomas looked toward the wet orchard. "You have perhaps 48 hours before those cracks become a real problem. Then we should stop talking." Evelyn organized the harvest with the same discipline she once used for church suppers. Clean, shallow splits went into blue bins for immediate pressing. Apples with heavy bruising went into yellow bins for cooking after damaged sections were removed. Moldy, rotten, or contaminated fruit went into red discard bins. Nothing crossed categories. Mabel monitored the wash water and prepared the kettle for apple butter. June trimmed labels and answered the farmhouse telephone as though she had been appointed public relations director. Thomas drove the small tractor between the rows, despite Evelyn's objections, while Moses followed at a steady trot. The first pressing began that afternoon. The machine shook, squealed once, and then settled into rhythm. Crushed apples moved through the belt, releasing cloudy amber juice into the stainless tank. Evelyn heated the cider according to Hannah's approved process, checked the temperature twice, recorded the time, and filled the first bottles while they were still warm. The scent filled the shed. Fresh apple, rain, cinnamon from Mabel's kettle, and something older that Evelyn remembered from Margaret's kitchen. For the trial, she limited herself to 3 products allowed under the preparation plan: pasteurized sweet cider, apple butter, and apple pies available only by advance order. Vinegar would take months. Hard cider required a different license. Evelyn refused to turn urgency into carelessness. They built the roadside stand from lumber stored behind the barn. Thomas cut the boards, Mabel painted the shelves, and June insisted the stand needed curtains until everyone else overruled her. Evelyn painted the name across a wide whiteboard: Harper's Second Harvest. Beneath it she added, "Good apples deserve another chance." On Saturday morning they carried 120 bottles of cider, 36 jars of apple butter, and a handwritten pie order sheet to the roadside. Moses settled beside the sign, his front paws crossed and his left ear folded at its familiar angle. The first customer stopped because of him. She was an elderly woman traveling toward Lake Michigan with her daughter. She bought 1 bottle, tasted it in the parking area, then returned for 4 more. A family with 2 children stopped next, then a cyclist, then a pickup carrying 3 orchard workers. By 10:30, cars were parked along the grass shoulder. June poured samples and told customers the cider had more dignity than most men in Cedar Hollow. Mabel quietly prevented her from giving away half the inventory. Evelyn took payments, recorded every sale, and tried not to stare at the shrinking rows of bottles. At 11:43, she sold the final one. Shortly before noon, a woman named Bethany Cole arrived from the Cedar Hollow diner. Bethany was 48, tall and angular, with dark hair tied beneath a blue bandana and the brisk, friendly impatience of someone who had managed breakfast crowds for 20 years. After tasting the apple butter, she ordered 12 jars for the diner's weekend biscuits and asked whether Evelyn could provide cider for an autumn special. Evelyn did not promise more than she could produce. Bethany respected that answer and left a deposit. Thomas stood near the barn watching the empty stand. He did not congratulate Evelyn. He only asked how much they had spent and how much they had earned. When she showed him the figures, he studied them carefully. "One morning is not a business," he said. "No," Evelyn replied, "but it is more than nothing." The last visitor arrived in an older silver Chevrolet. Luis Mendoza stepped out slowly, carrying himself with the caution of a man who had spent years around forklifts and loading docks. At 58, he was medium height and solidly built, with graying black hair, a trimmed beard, and deep lines around watchful brown eyes. He had served as Blackwood's receiving foreman before leaving the company the previous winter. People in Cedar Hollow described him as private but dependable, the kind of man who remembered every truck number and never signed a form without reading it. He bought 2 bottles Evelyn had held back for the family and turned one in his hands. "Curtis know you're doing this?" he asked. "The apples were rejected. They belong to us." Luis nodded. Evelyn mentioned the mismatch between the delivery ticket and Blackwood's payment statement. For a moment his face became completely still. He looked toward Thomas, then toward the road. "How much was missing?" 1,660 pounds. Luis opened his mouth, but a truck passed and drowned the first words. When the noise faded, he only said, "Keep every piece of paper they give you." Evelyn asked whether he knew something. Luis tightened his grip on the bottles. "I know paperwork has a way of changing after people stop looking at it." He placed the bottles in his car and left before she could ask another question. Rain returned lightly on Sunday night. By Monday morning, Evelyn had prepared another batch and arranged the shed for Hannah's promised follow-up visit. At 8:15, a white county vehicle turned into the driveway. A woman stepped out wearing dark slacks, practical shoes, and a gray jacket bearing the county health department seal. She was in her early 50s, with straight blonde hair cut at the jaw and a narrow, serious face. She introduced herself as Inspector Helen Price. Her voice was professional rather than unfriendly, but she did not accept the cup of coffee June immediately offered. "I'm here in response to a complaint," Helen said. Evelyn glanced toward the clean equipment shed. "What kind of complaint?" Helen opened a folder. "The caller stated that you are collecting rotten apples from a commercial waste pile and selling them to the public." The yard seemed to go silent. Thomas looked toward the road. Mabel lowered the thermometer in her hand. June, for once, had nothing to say. Helen Price turned toward the shed and removed a pair of inspection gloves. "Until I complete my review," she said, "you cannot sell another bottle." Inspector Helen Price began with the water supply. She turned on the stainless sink, filled a sterile vial, checked the hot water temperature, and followed the drain pipe with the careful suspicion of someone who trusted evidence more than appearances. Evelyn stood beside the clean table with her batch logs open, while Thomas remained near the shed door with his arms crossed. June Callahan watched from a folding chair, visibly suffering from the effort of staying silent. Mabel Ortiz stood beside the pasteurizing kettle, calm and attentive, ready to answer any question about sanitation. Helen inspected the incoming fruit bins one by one. She lifted apples, examined their cracks, smelled the exposed flesh, and rejected 3 pieces Evelyn's team had already placed in the discard container. She checked the washwater records, bottle invoices, thermometer calibration, storage shelves, pest barriers, and the labels Evelyn had printed with the product name, ingredients, processing date, and farm address. Hannah Reed arrived midway through the inspection after Evelyn called her. Hannah wore a dark green raincoat over practical clothes and carried a thick folder of extension guidelines beneath one arm. She did not interfere with Helen's work. Instead, she quietly produced the written process she had helped Evelyn prepare and confirmed that the sweet cider was being pasteurized according to the approved temperature and time. Helen compared the document against Evelyn's handwritten logs. Each batch showed where the apples had been harvested, when they were sorted, the temperature reached during treatment, and the number of bottles filled. Evelyn had even recorded the jars June accidentally dropped and the 4 bottles that had failed to seal properly. Helen looked at her over the top of the folder. "Most new operators leave out the mistakes," Evelyn replied. "A record that only remembers what went right is not much of a record." By late morning, Helen had found no serious violation. She required Evelyn to add a separate hand-washing sign and move 1 box of empty labels away from the chemical storage shelf. Otherwise, the operation met the county's requirements. Helen closed her folder and removed her gloves. "You may resume sales," she said. June released a breath so loudly that Moses lifted his head. "Would you like that coffee now?" she asked. Helen almost smiled. "Now I would." The anonymous complaint did not damage Harper's second harvest in the way its sender had intended. By Tuesday afternoon, half of Cedar Hollow had heard that the county had inspected Evelyn's shed and found it cleaner than several restaurant kitchens. People who had never stopped at the roadside stand came out of curiosity. Some wanted to support the Harpers. Others simply wanted to see whether cider made from rejected apples tasted different. Evelyn refused to lower her standards for the larger crowd. She limited production to what the shed could safely handle and posted a sign when each day's supply sold out. A young reporter from the Cedar Hollow Gazette visited on Wednesday. Her name was Lydia Grant, a 29-year-old black woman with close-cropped curls, a mustard-colored jacket, and an alert expression that made people feel she was listening even before she opened her notebook. Lydia had grown up in Detroit and moved to Cedar Hollow after becoming tired of covering city council disputes for a large newspaper. She preferred stories about ordinary people whose work revealed something larger about a community. She photographed Evelyn beside the press, Mabel checking the kettle, June arranging jars, and Moses resting below the white sign. The short article appeared beneath the headline, "Local Woman Gives Rejected Apples a Second Harvest." Lydia described Evelyn as a 67-year-old homemaker transforming cosmetically rejected fruit into safe, popular products. Evelyn disliked the word homemaker, only because the article placed it beside the phrase, "first business venture," as though her previous 40 years had been empty space. Still, she clipped the article and placed it beside Margaret's notebook. Thomas said little about the attention. He continued delivering accepted apples to Blackwood, supervising picking crews, and helping repair equipment, but his breathing remained uneven. Twice Evelyn saw him pause at the barn door with one hand pressed against his chest. Each time he blamed dust, poor sleep, or the humidity. Moses had begun following him more closely than before. The dog no longer wandered to the creek while Thomas worked. He remained within several yards, watching every movement with dark, steady eyes. On Thursday morning, Thomas stopped at the Cedar Hollow Farmers Cooperative for coffee and a replacement hydraulic fitting. The co-op cafe occupied one side of the feed store and served as the unofficial court of local agriculture. Men gathered there before sunrise to discuss weather, crop prices, machinery, and neighbors who were not present. The counter smelled of burnt coffee, bacon grease, and damp work jackets. Curtis Blackwood sat near the register with 3 growers and Warren Pike, a 52-year-old farm equipment dealer with a thick neck, a shaved head, and a laugh that usually arrived before he understood the joke. Curtis noticed Thomas and raised his coffee cup. "Heard Evelyn's little stand made the paper," he said. Thomas answered that it had. Curtis smiled. "Good for her. Everyone needs a hobby in the fall." Warren chuckled. Another grower asked whether Blackwood planned to buy the split fruit for juice. Curtis replied that serious packing businesses did not reorganize themselves every time someone sold a few jars beside the road. "By November," he said, "the tourists go home, the cider freezes, and people remember why orchards need actual buyers." 2 men laughed. Thomas did not. But neither did he object. He paid for the fitting and left, telling himself silence protected the contract that still carried most of the Harper crop. June heard about the conversation before lunchtime. Warren Pike's sister attended the same church sewing group, and Cedar Hollow gossip traveled more efficiently than refrigerated freight. June arrived at the equipment shed with indignation bright in her pink glasses. Mabel tried to stop her, but June told Evelyn exactly what Curtis had said, and exactly what Thomas had failed to say. Evelyn did not confront her husband until evening. She waited until the workers had gone. The last kettle was cooling, and Moses lay between their chairs on the porch. Thomas admitted the conversation. "What did you expect me to do?" he asked. "Start a fight at the co-op 3 weeks before peak harvest?" Evelyn looked across the darkening orchard. "I expected you to tell him I was doing real work. He controls where most of our apples go. And he has been paying us for fewer apples than we deliver. We do not know that. We know the numbers do not match." Thomas rubbed both hands over his face. "I am trying to protect this farm." Evelyn's voice remained quiet. "No, you are trying to protect the way you have always understood this farm." He stared at her. She continued. "You trusted Curtis's smile more than my records. You trusted his experience more than the woman who kept your books, stretched every bad season, and fed every worker who ever came through this house." Thomas stood too quickly, and for a moment the porch seemed to move beneath him. He caught the railing before Evelyn could reach him. "I'm tired," he said. "That is all. You have been tired for weeks. Harvest makes everyone tired." He went inside, leaving Moses on the porch between them. A hard wind moved through Cedar Hollow overnight. Shortly after dawn, Thomas saw a heavy limb hanging above one of the older gala rows. If it fell, it could damage several trees and block the lane needed by the picking crew. Evelyn was in the shed preparing bottles for the morning batch. Thomas did not tell her he was going out. He took a pruning saw, loaded an orchard ladder onto the utility cart, and drove toward the north block. Moses followed. The grass remained wet from the night's moisture. Thomas set the ladder beneath the broken limb and tested the ground with his boot. Moses circled once, then stood beneath him, whining softly. "Stay back," Thomas said. He climbed 6 rungs and reached for the branch. Halfway through the cut, a wave of dizziness struck. The orchard tilted. Sunlight flashed white between the leaves. Thomas tightened one hand around the ladder, but his fingers no longer seemed to belong to him. Moses barked once, sharp and urgent. Thomas tried to descend. His boot missed the rung. He fell sideways, struck a lower branch, and landed heavily between 2 trees. For several seconds he did not move. Moses rushed to him, sniffing his face and chest. Thomas opened his eyes but could not sit up. Pain tore through his left leg, and his heart beat in violent, uneven bursts. Moses barked toward the farmhouse. When no one came, the old German shepherd ran. Evelyn heard scratching against the back door while the pasteurizing kettle heated. She opened it and found Moses panting, mud on his paws and his leashless collar crooked around his neck. He turned, ran several yards, then looked back. Evelyn understood immediately. She shut off the burner and followed him. Moses led her through the north rows to Thomas. The ladder lay on its side, and the pruning saw rested several feet away. Thomas's left leg bent unnaturally below the knee. His face was gray, and each breath seemed to require thought. Evelyn called emergency services, covered him with her cardigan, and kept one hand against his shoulder, while Moses lay pressed against his uninjured side. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. One of the paramedics, Caleb Monroe, was a compact 35-year-old man with a shaved head and a steady voice shaped by years of volunteer rescue work. He immobilized Thomas's leg, attached heart monitor leads, and immediately frowned at the rhythm on the screen. "This isn't only the fall," he told Evelyn. "His heartbeat is irregular." At Cedar Hollow Regional Hospital, X-rays confirmed a fractured lower leg. An electrocardiogram revealed a persistent arrhythmia that had likely caused the dizziness. Dr. Samuel Pierce, a 60-year-old cardiologist with silver hair, tired blue eyes, and the direct manner of a man who had learned that comforting lies could kill patients, told Thomas the condition had probably been developing for months. Medication and further testing would be necessary. The leg would keep him away from orchard work for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. Thomas stared at the ceiling. Evelyn stood beside his bed with dried mud on her shoes and apple juice still staining one sleeve. Then her phone rang. It was Earl Benton from Blackwood. The peak harvest schedule had been moved forward. The largest picking run of the season would begin in 3 days. Evelyn looked through the hospital window at Moses waiting beside June in the parking area below. The cider stand needed production. The orchard needed a manager. Thomas could do neither. For the first time in 40 years, every decision rested with her. She could close Harper's second harvest and use every available hand to save the main crop. Or she could attempt to run both operations and risk losing the cider business, the harvest, and the land beneath them. Evelyn made her decision before sunrise the next morning. She would not close the roadside stand, and she would not abandon the main harvest. At 67, with less than 3 hours of sleep and mud still dried along the edges of her shoes, she stood in the Harper kitchen and divided a yellow legal pad into 3 columns. The first was for apples Blackwood would accept. The second was for sound fruit that could be processed into cider or apple butter. The third was for transportation, equipment, and storage. She studied Thomas's orchard maps, the weather forecast, the ripening dates he had written in the margins, and the picking records she had quietly maintained for years. Then she called every seasonal worker before 6:30 and asked them to meet beside the south barn. 6 men and 4 women arrived beneath a cold September sky, carrying coffee and the uneasy expressions of people who had expected instructions from Thomas. The oldest among them was Raymond Lee, a 54-year-old crew leader with a lean frame, weather-darkened skin, and a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw. Raymond had worked at Harper Orchard for 12 seasons. He respected Evelyn as the woman who remembered every worker's birthday and made soup when someone was ill. But he had never taken production orders from her. "Mrs. Harper," he said carefully, "we can delay the cider operation until Mr. Harper comes home." "No," Evelyn answered. "We will delay nothing. We will organize it." She assigned Raymond to the market fruit crew in the eastern Gala block. A second group would collect clean split fruit and lightly scarred apples for processing. A third would move full bins, maintain the tractor lanes, and deliver accepted fruit to Blackwood. Each crew received a board listing row numbers, target bins, and departure times. Evelyn taped a large chart to the barn wall and marked each completed load with a red pencil. She had used similar charts to serve 200 church guests without running out of coffee, meat, or clean plates. Apples, she decided, were not so different. They simply complained less. The first morning was rough. One tractor arrived at the wrong block. The processing crew mixed 2 bins that should have remained separate. A young picker named Cody Mills, a lanky 20-year-old with sandy hair and more confidence than experience, told Raymond that Thomas had never made them record every partial bin. Evelyn heard him. "Thomas also knew the orchard well enough to carry half the schedule in his head," she said. "His head is currently in a hospital bed, so today we use the board." Cody flushed and returned to work. Evelyn walked every block herself, checking ripeness, bruising, and picking speed. She knew the north slope colored 3 days before the lower ground. She knew the trees near Miller Creek produced sweeter fruit, but split after heavy rain. She knew which tractor overheated on long climbs, and which workers picked quickly but damaged stems when rushed. These were things she had learned while carrying lunches, tracking payroll envelopes, driving replacement parts into the orchard, and listening to Thomas talk at supper. No one had called that management. By noon, the crews were behind by 37 bins. Evelyn moved 4 workers from the western block, changed the lunch schedule, and sent Mabel Ortiz to supervise sorting at the shed. June Callahan took control of the roadside stand and announced that anyone who touched her cash box without permission would lose a finger. By 5 o'clock, the orchard had recovered 29 of the missing bins. At 7, Evelyn served beef stew, cornbread, and hot coffee from folding tables inside the barn. She had prepared the meal before dawn because she understood something Thomas often forgot. Tired workers did not become faster merely because a farmer needed them to. The crews stayed another 2 hours. When the last tractor came in, Raymond Lee studied the red marks covering Evelyn's chart. "We moved more fruit today than yesterday," he admitted. "Yes, Evelyn said. "And tomorrow we will waste less time learning who is in charge." Her daughter arrived from Grand Rapids after midnight. Rachel Harper was 39, 5'7" with shoulder-length chestnut hair, pale green eyes inherited from Evelyn, and the direct posture of someone accustomed to hospital corridors and urgent decisions. She worked as an emergency room nurse and had spent 16 years learning how to remain calm while frightened people shouted around her. Her relationship with Thomas had always been loving but strained. He had expected her to return to the orchard after college. She had chosen medicine instead, partly because she could not bear the idea of spending her life asking permission from the land. Rachel hugged her mother in the kitchen, then opened the refrigerator, found nothing but cider, mustard, and leftover stew, and said, "You have been feeding everyone except yourself again." By breakfast, she had created an online order form, answered 23 messages from customers, reorganized the stand's receipts, and posted that Harper's Second Harvest would remain open during the family emergency. She also insisted that Evelyn sit down long enough to eat 2 eggs. Moses stayed close to Rachel throughout the morning. The dog seemed unsettled without Thomas, repeatedly walking to the truck and looking toward the road. That afternoon, Rachel drove him to Cedar Hollow Regional Hospital. Hospital rules did not allow Moses inside the cardiac wing, so Thomas was taken in a wheelchair to a ground-floor window. Rachel stood outside with the German Shepherd. Moses saw Thomas through the glass, lifted his head, and pressed his nose against the window. Thomas raised one hand to the other side. For several seconds, the old farmer and the aging dog remained separated by nothing but glass, and everything neither could understand. Rachel looked away to give her father privacy. That evening, Rachel opened the farm accounts at the dining room table. Unlike Evelyn, who preferred paper ledgers, Rachel worked through digital bank statements, loan documents, Blackwood payment records, and tax files. The 18-acre south parcel had been pledged as collateral the previous year when the main irrigation pump failed. Thomas had borrowed to replace the pump, repair underground lines, and cover payroll after 2 springs of frost damage. That part matched what he had confessed. The deeper problem appeared in the income records. Blackwood had downgraded increasing amounts of Harper fruit during each of the last 3 seasons. Some loads showed unexplained reductions between receiving weight and paid weight. Others had been shifted from grade A to grade B without detailed inspection reports. Each difference seemed small when viewed alone. Together, they represented tens of thousands of dollars. "Dad was expecting the orchard to recover," Rachel said. "But every time production improved, the paid volume fell." Evelyn placed the missing weight ticket from Chapter 1 beside the others. "Can you prove they did it deliberately?" "Not from our records alone," Rachel replied. "But I can prove we were paid for less fruit than we delivered." Evelyn felt anger rising, but beneath it lay something more painful. Thomas had watched the money disappear and blamed himself. He had borrowed against the land because he believed he had failed to grow enough, manage enough, endure enough. Evelyn did not forgive the secrecy, but she understood its shape. Thomas had inherited the orchard with his father's warning that a Harper must never be the generation that lost it. Each bad season had sounded to him like a personal accusation. The next 2 days pushed Evelyn close to exhaustion. She moved between the orchard, processing shed, roadside stand, hospital, and farmhouse, sleeping in short stretches and carrying a notebook in the pocket of her cardigan. Harper's Second Harvest continued selling out. Bethany Cole increased the Cedar Hollow Diner's apple butter order, and Lydia Grant's newspaper article brought customers from neighboring towns. Yet the main crop still depended on Blackwood. Every accepted truckload felt less like security and more like a reminder that Curtis controlled the gate through which most of their income passed. On Friday afternoon, Earl Benton arrived at the orchard in a Blackwood pickup. The foreman did not remove his red cap when he approached Evelyn, which she recognized as embarrassment rather than disrespect. He handed her a sealed envelope. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to deliver this directly." "What is it?" Earl looked toward the workers and lowered his voice. "I think you should read it inside." The letter was brief. Blackwood Packing House would complete the current seasonal obligations, but would not renew Harper Orchard's purchasing contract for the following year. The stated reason was a change in distribution needs and supplier consolidation. There was no mention of the cider stand, the rejected fruit, or Evelyn's questions about the payment records. None was necessary. Without Blackwood, the Harpers would lose the buyer responsible for nearly 3/4 of their fresh fruit sales. A roadside stand could sell hundreds of bottles. It could not absorb 55 acres of marketable apples. Evelyn took the letter to the hospital that evening. Thomas sat upright with his fractured leg elevated, his face thinner than it had been a week before. The doctors had begun medication for the arrhythmia, but he would need continued monitoring and months of recovery. He read the letter once and placed it on the blanket. He did not curse Curtis. He did not ask whether the decision could be challenged. Instead, he looked toward the dark hospital window. "We should sell the South 18, he said, "pay the bank, reduce the orchard, and retire before the rest goes with it." Evelyn stared at him. Thomas had fought drought, frost, insects, broken equipment, and bad markets for more than 40 years. She had never heard surrender in his voice before. "That land contains your father's first commercial block," she said. "Trees can be replanted." "Not after developers divide it into lawns." Thomas closed his eyes. "I cannot ask you to carry this." "You did not ask. I am already carrying it." He looked at her then, but the strength behind his eyes had dimmed. "Cider will not buy an entire crop, Evie." "Not yet." "There may not be time for yet." Outside the hospital, Rachel waited beside the truck with Moses. The German shepherd stood when Evelyn emerged, searching behind her for Thomas. When he realized Thomas was not coming, he lowered his head but remained beside the door. Evelyn looked at her daughter, the dog, and the Blackwood letter in her hand. The bank wanted $40,000. The orchard's largest buyer had abandoned them. Thomas was ready to sacrifice the land before anyone else could take it. Evelyn understood then that saving the harvest was no longer enough. She would have to find a new future for all 55 acres of apples. And she would have to do it before the next season began. By the first week of October, the maple trees along County Road 8 had begun turning red, and cold air settled over Harper Orchard before sunrise. Thomas remained under medical supervision, leaving Evelyn and Rachel to plan for a future without Blackwood's contract. Evelyn refused to gamble the remaining savings on a large expansion. Instead, she chose one new customer, one new market, and one new product at a time. Rachel began by taking 24 bottles of sweet cider and 18 jars of apple butter to the Saturday Farmers Market in Holland. The market coordinator, Naomi Brooks, was a sturdy 45-year-old woman with sandy hair cut at her shoulders, and the alert, practical nature of someone who had spent 15 years separating serious growers from weekend hobbyists. Naomi inspected Evelyn's permits, labels, and insurance before allowing the products onto a folding table near the market entrance. By 11 o'clock, nearly everything had sold. Several customers returned after tasting the cider, saying it carried a deeper flavor than the clear, heavily filtered juice sold in supermarkets. Naomi offered Rachel a regular space for the rest of the season. A week later, Harbor Table, a farm-to-table restaurant in Grand Haven, placed an order for cider. Its owner, Owen Mercer, was a 51-year-old former hotel chef with a tall, narrow frame, close-cropped black hair, and a habit of asking direct questions while tasting food in complete silence. Owen had left Chicago after 20 years in commercial kitchens because he wanted to buy ingredients from people whose names he knew. He visited Harper Orchard, examined the processing shed, and tasted cider from 3 separate batches before ordering enough for an autumn dinner menu. He also asked Evelyn whether she could provide reduced cider syrup for pork dishes. Evelyn did not say yes immediately. She calculated the labor, tested a small batch, and promised only what the equipment could safely produce. A specialty shop in Grand Rapids followed. The Michigan Pantry was owned by Priya Shah, a 36-year-old Indian-American woman with long dark hair, gold-rimmed glasses, and a precise manner shaped by years of watching small food companies promise more than they could deliver. Priya agreed to carry Harper's apple butter and cider on consignment for 30 days. If the products did not sell, the Harpers would bear the loss. Rachel disliked the arrangement, but Evelyn accepted it because the risk was limited and the shop reached customers they could never attract from a roadside stand. Hard cider created a more difficult opportunity. Evelyn's current permits did not allow her to produce or sell alcohol. She refused to cut corners merely because the orchard needed money. Hannah Reed introduced her to Grant Ellison, the 47-year-old owner of Lake Wind Cidery near Saugatuck. Grant was a broad man with a reddish beard, powerful forearms, and the patient attention of a former laboratory chemist. He had opened the cidery after leaving a pharmaceutical company and treated fermentation as equal parts science, agriculture, and controlled stubbornness. Grant inspected the Harper apples and found that the cosmetically rejected fruit had strong sugar levels and enough acidity to create a balanced cider. Under their agreement, Lake Wind would purchase Harper apples at a fair processing price, produce a limited batch under its own license, and list Harper Orchard as the fruit source. Evelyn would not invest in fermentation tanks or pretend to understand a business she had not yet learned. "You are being unusually cautious for someone trying to save a farm," Grant told her. "I spent 40 years stretching money," Evelyn replied. "The idea of having to put caution is not the same as fear." The new outlets did not replace Blackwood, but they gave the orchard several smaller doors instead of one enormous gate. Rachel tracked every bottle, jar, market fee, fuel charge, and wholesale payment. For the first time, Evelyn could see a path that did not depend entirely on Curtis Blackwood's approval. The path was narrow, but it existed. Then, on a Wednesday morning, Rachel found the photograph. An anonymous social media account called Cedar Hollow Truth had posted 3 images of rotten apples lying in black water beside the Blackwood waste bins. The caption claimed that Harper's second harvest collected fruit from commercial garbage piles, washed away the visible rot, and sold the result to elderly customers and children. The post used phrases from the earlier health complaint and included a blurred photograph of Evelyn's roadside stand. Within 2 hours, customers began sending questions. By noon, 9 online orders had been canceled. Priya Shaw called from Grand Rapids and said she had to pause the consignment display until the accusation was addressed. Owen Mercer did not cancel his restaurant order, but he asked for updated inspection documents. At the Holland Market, Naomi moved the Harper table away from the main entrance after 2 vendors complained. Evelyn read the post only once. She set Rachel's phone on the kitchen table and asked, "Can we prove where those photographs were taken?" Rachel enlarged the images. One showed a section of blue loading dock railing and a faded number painted on the wall. Evelyn recognized it as the waste area behind Blackwood Packing House. "They photographed their own trash," Rachel said, "and told people it was ours." Hannah Reed acted quickly. She released a written statement confirming that Harper's processing plan had been reviewed, the county inspection had found no serious violations, and only properly sorted fruit from the Harper property entered the food production area. Lydia Grant returned with a photographer from the Cedar Hollow Gazette. Evelyn opened every section of the shed, showed the blue processing bins, red discard bins, batch records, wash stations, temperature logs, and invoices. Helen Price would not comment on the anonymous accusation, but the county confirmed that Harper's second harvest remained authorized to operate. The newspaper published the facts the following morning. Some customers returned, others did not. A lie, Evelyn learned, needed only a few seconds to enter a person's mind. The truth required paperwork, witnesses, photographs, and patience. That evening, after June and Mabel had gone home, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. Moses rose from beside the stove and gave one low bark. A silver Chevrolet stopped near the equipment shed, and Luis Mendoza stepped out carrying a canvas document bag. He looked more tired than when he had visited the stand. His graying beard had grown uneven, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper. He asked whether Rachel was present. When Evelyn nodded, he said, "Then both of you should see this." At the dining room table, Luis explained that Blackwood had dismissed him the previous winter. The official reason had been restructuring. The real conflict began after Luis questioned repeated differences between receiving weights, grading reports, and final payment records. As receiving foreman, he had signed truck tickets and maintained a personal work journal so he could resolve disputes between growers and drivers. He had also printed copies of several emails he sent to management, because Curtis often responded verbally and later denied conversations had occurred. "I did not steal company records," Luis said. "These are my copies of documents I signed, messages I sent, and notes I kept while doing my job." He removed bundles organized by year. The first contained receiving tickets showing fruit accepted as Grade B. The corresponding payment summaries listed much of that same fruit as cull or processing waste. A second bundle contained shipment numbers from trucks that carried the downgraded apples to North Shore Juice Works, an industrial processor outside Muskegon. Blackwood had paid growers the low reject rate, then sold the same fruit at a considerably higher processing price. Rachel placed Thomas's papers beside Luis's records. The load Evelyn discovered in Chapter 1 appeared in his journal. 18,600 pounds had crossed the receiving scale. 1,660 pounds were removed from the paid total, recorded internally as low-grade processing fruit, and shipped out 2 days later. "They did not disappear," Evelyn said. "No," Luis replied. "They were sold twice. Once when Thomas delivered them, and again when Blackwood moved them." The room became very quiet. Moses lay beneath Evelyn's chair with his head resting on her shoe. Luis showed them additional names. 17 farms appeared repeatedly across his records. Some had lost only a few hundred pounds per load. Others had lost several thousand. Because the deductions were spread across categories, dates, and settlements, many growers would have assumed the losses came from spoilage or grading. Rachel asked whether Luis believed Curtis had ordered the health complaint and the online post. Luis shook his head. He had no proof, but a current Blackwood employee had bragged at a tavern that the company needed to teach that old woman where she belongs. The employee might have acted alone, or he might have understood what his employer wanted without receiving direct instructions. "Do not accuse Curtis of that unless you can prove it," Luis warned. Rachel looked at the stacks of documents. "Can we go public with the weight records?" "Not yet." Luis explained that Blackwood employed a regional law firm, maintained relationships with lenders and grocery buyers, and could bury the Harpers in legal costs. The documents strongly suggested a pattern, but the family needed independent records from other growers and confirmation from the juice processor. If Evelyn made public accusations before securing those sources, Curtis could call Luis a disgruntled former employee and sue the Harpers for defamation. Evelyn looked at the evidence covering the table. The orchard needed customers. The bank deadline was approaching. Fighting Blackwood could frighten retailers, consume time, and destroy what remained of Thomas's reputation in Cedar Hollow. Remaining silent would allow Evelyn to focus on her own business. It would also leave 17 families trapped inside the same system that had nearly taken the Harper land. Outside, wind moved through the apple trees, sending dry leaves scraping across the porch like paper being shuffled in unseen hands. Evelyn placed her palm on Margaret's old blue notebook, then looked at the names in Lewis's journal. Saving her own orchard was already more than anyone had expected of her. But now she knew the truth could save others, or ruin them all if she revealed it too soon. By midnight, Evelyn still had not decided whether to hide the documents or carry them into the light. Evelyn did not post a single page of Luis Mendoza's records online. Rachel wanted to expose Blackwood immediately, but Evelyn understood that anger could make a person move faster than truth was able to follow. For the next 3 weeks, the dining room at Harper Farmhouse became an investigation room. Delivery tickets, payment statements, tax records, grading reports, and Lewis's handwritten journals covered the table where the family had once eaten Sunday dinners. Rachel built spreadsheets late into the night. Lewis checked truck numbers and signatures. Hannah Reed reviewed the documents only for facts she could responsibly confirm, refusing to speculate beyond the evidence. Evelyn made coffee, labeled folders, and asked the same simple question again and again. What entered Blackwood? What was paid for? And where did the difference go? Moses usually slept beneath the table, lifting his silvered head whenever voices grew tense. Evelyn had no formal training in accounting, but she understood household arithmetic better than most people understood pride. If 12 jars entered a pantry and only 10 appeared in the ledger, 2 jars had not vanished because of moisture. The first grower they approached was Warren Pike, the equipment dealer who had laughed when Curtis called Evelyn's stand a hobby. Warren owned 15 acres of apple trees behind his machinery yard. He was broad-necked, loud, and accustomed to hiding uncertainty beneath humor. When Rachel asked to see his Blackwood statements, his face hardened. "I am not joining a feud," he said. Evelyn replied that she was not asking him to choose a side. She was asking whether he had been paid for what he delivered. Warren refused twice. On the third visit, after learning that one of his largest loads had lost more than 900 pounds between receiving and payment, he placed a cardboard box of records on Evelyn's porch without apology. The second grower was Martha Bell, a 72-year-old widow who managed 20 acres with her 2 grandsons. Martha was tall and bony, with white hair cut bluntly at her jaw and a voice roughened by decades of cold mornings. Her husband had died in a tractor accident 12 years earlier, leaving her suspicious of any man who claimed complicated systems were beyond her understanding. She opened her filing cabinet before Evelyn had finished explaining. Her records showed the same pattern: fruit accepted at one weight, downgraded later, then paid at a lower amount without supporting inspection reports. Other farmers were harder to convince. Blackwood still controlled much of the county's distribution. Several feared that even asking questions could cost them next year's contract. Evelyn met them privately in kitchens, barns, church basements, and parked trucks. She never promised victory. She only showed them where the figures failed to match. By the end of the third week, 9 growers had provided complete records, and 8 more had agreed to confirm specific deliveries if protected by the county association. The inconsistencies were no longer isolated mistakes. They formed a repeated pattern across years, varieties, and farms. The strongest confirmation came from North Shore Juice Works. Its regional purchasing manager, Daniel Cho, agreed to speak after Rachel sent copies of several shipment numbers. Daniel was a 46-year-old Korean-American man with neatly parted black hair, a narrow face, and the restrained manner of someone who knew careless words could become legal exhibits. He had worked in industrial fruit processing for 20 years and had no personal loyalty to either side. Daniel confirmed that North Shore had purchased thousands of pounds of processing-grade apples from Blackwood, on dates matching Luis's records. Some shipments were much larger than the amounts Blackwood had reported as rejected fruit. Daniel would not accuse Curtis of fraud, but he agreed to verify invoices and testify that the fruit had been purchased for commercial processing rather than discarded. With the records assembled, the Cedar Hollow Orchard Growers Association called an emergency meeting for November 22 at the county hall. The building was a 2-story brick structure beside the courthouse, usually used for zoning disputes, tax appeals, and community dinners. That evening, every chair was filled. Growers stood along the back wall in work jackets and muddy boots. Lydia Grant sat near the aisle with her notebook closed on her lap, waiting for the meeting to become public record before writing a word. Curtis Blackwood arrived with Martin Shaw, a 59-year-old attorney from Grand Rapids. Martin was thin, silver-haired, and immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that looked almost theatrical among the farmers. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and specialized in making ordinary people doubt their own understanding of simple facts. Curtis wore his usual Navy Company polo beneath a dark jacket. He appeared calm, though the skin around his mouth tightened when he saw Luis sitting beside Evelyn. The association chairman opened the meeting and allowed Curtis to speak first. Curtis described the weight differences as normal results of moisture loss, storage shrinkage, grading adjustments, and transportation waste. He said agricultural accounting was complicated and warned against damaging a local employer over misunderstandings. Martin Shaw added that accusations based on incomplete private records could expose individuals to serious legal consequences. The room grew uneasy. Several growers lowered their eyes. Evelyn recognized the old power working exactly as it always had. Make the numbers sound mysterious, make the people questioning them feel small, and let fear finish the argument. Then she stood. At 67, Evelyn looked almost slight behind the wooden podium. She wore a plain navy dress, low shoes, and the silver brooch Margaret Harper had once pinned to her church coat. Her hands trembled when she unfolded the first page, so she placed them flat on either side of the paper until they steadied. She did not call Curtis a thief. She began with Thomas's load. 18,600 pounds entered Blackwood on August 24, she said. 16,940 pounds appeared on the payment statement. The missing 1,660 pounds were listed internally as processing fruit and shipped to North Shore Juice Works 2 days later. Martin interrupted to mention moisture loss. Evelyn looked at him. Did the apples lose moisture and then regain enough weight to be sold to the processor? A murmur moved through the room. She continued, one farm at a time. She showed the receiving weights, paid weights, changed grades, shipment dates, and resale records. She explained the figures without technical language. She compared them to buying 12 eggs, being paid for 10, and watching the buyer sell all 12 to someone else. The men who had once laughed at her cider stand listened in complete silence. Luis stood next. He confirmed the signatures on the receiving tickets and explained why he had retained copies of documents connected to his work. Martin tried to portray him as a bitter former employee. Luis answered calmly that losing his job had made him angry, but anger had not changed the truck numbers, dates, or weights. Martha Bell rose from the third row and held up her own records. Warren Pike followed, his face red with embarrassment. One after another, growers supplied documents created independently of Luis. Finally, Daniel Cho joined the meeting by video call and verified that North Shore Juice Works had purchased the shipments in question. Curtis's patience began to fracture. He insisted that staff errors might have occurred during a period of rapid expansion. He denied ordering anyone to alter records. Martin requested that the discussion end until attorneys could review the material. Before the chairman could respond, the rear doors opened. Thomas entered on crutches. His left leg remained in a brace, and weeks of illness had thinned his face. But he wore a clean white shirt and the brown orchard jacket his father had given him 30 years earlier. Rachel moved to help, but he shook his head and crossed the hall slowly under his own strength. He stopped beside Evelyn. "For most of my life," Thomas said, "I believe protecting the orchard meant protecting the arrangements that kept it alive. I thought questioning Blackwood would endanger my family. I was so afraid of change that I trusted a system I could see failing before I trusted my own wife." Evelyn looked at him but said nothing. Thomas faced the room. "My greatest mistake was not believing Curtis Blackwood. It was failing to understand that the woman who kept our accounts, fed our workers, stretched every poor season, and held our family together for 40 years, was already running more of that farm than I ever admitted." Curtis looked away. By the meeting's end, the Growers Association voted to submit the records to the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. A state auditor contacted Rachel the following morning. One regional grocery chain announced that it would suspend new orders from Blackwood while the allegations were reviewed. The investigation would examine grading practices, weight adjustments, resale records, and grower payments across multiple seasons. The public response restored Harper's reputation. Priya Shah returned the products to her store shelves. Naomi Brooks offered Rachel a larger market space. Harbor Table renewed its order, and online sales rose after Lydia's article described the county meeting. But justice moved more slowly than debt. On November 27th, Rachel finished updating the farm accounts. The room was quiet, except for the clock above the stove and the soft breathing of Moses near the heater. They had sold more cider, apple butter, pies, and wholesale product than Evelyn had imagined possible. Yet after medical expenses, supplies, payroll, and required farm costs, the account remained short. $6,240. The bank deadline was December 1st. Any repayment from Blackwood would take months, perhaps years. The state investigation could not stop the foreclosure process. Public sympathy could not alter the contract Evelyn and Thomas had signed. Only 4 days remained. Evelyn had helped an entire town find the courage to stand up. Now she had to decide whether there was still enough time to save the 18 acres beneath her own feet. On the morning of November 28th, frost silvered the empty branches of Harper Orchard, and the 18-acre south parcel lay beneath a white haze that made every fence post look fragile. Only 3 days remained before the bank deadline. By 9 o'clock, June Callahan had already suggested a church fundraiser, a benefit supper, and what she called a very tasteful public shaming of the bank. Evelyn refused all three. She would accept customers, contracts, and honest work, but she would not stand in front of Cedar Hollow asking people to rescue her with pity. The orchard had produced something valuable. If the family could not earn the remaining $6,240 from that value, then no collection plate would change the deeper problem. Rachel listened while Evelyn spoke, then turned her laptop around. "What if nobody donates anything?" she asked. "What if they buy products we are already able to make?" Her proposal was simple. Sell Christmas gift boxes in advance, collect deposits on legitimate spring orders, and offer only quantities the family could safely deliver. Each box would contain 2 bottles of pasteurized sweet cider, 1 jar of apple butter, a voucher for a freshly baked apple pie, and a small card telling the story of the apples that had nearly been thrown away. Evelyn studied the numbers. The profit would be lower than taking cash gifts, but every dollar would represent a real sale. "No promises we cannot keep," she said. Rachel nodded. No pity, just pre-orders. They called the program the Second Harvest Christmas Box. Lydia Grant mentioned it in the Cedar Hollow Gazette without describing it as a rescue campaign. Naomi Brooks offered Rachel a table at the final Holland Farmers Market of the season. Priya Shah increased the Michigan pantry order after receiving written confirmation from the county that Harper's second harvest remained in good standing. At Harbor Table in Grand Haven, Owen Mercer agreed to prepay 30% of a spring cider syrup order, provided Evelyn delivered the first batch by April. Grant Ellison at Lakewind Cidery placed a deposit on 12,000 pounds of Harper apples for the following year's limited hard cider release. Grant made the offer carefully. He was not helping out of charity. The test batch had fermented cleanly, and early tastings suggested the fruit could produce a commercially successful cider. "I need those apples," he told Evelyn. "That is the only reason I am signing." "Good," Evelyn replied. "That is the only reason I would accept." The first 20 Christmas boxes sold before noon. By evening, orders had come from Grand Rapids, Holland, Grand Haven, and several towns Evelyn had never visited. Cedar Hollow residents bought boxes for children living out of state. Retired teachers, pastors, nurses, and neighbors who had helped them through difficult years. No one arrived carrying an envelope marked donation. They arrived carrying order forms. June handled the telephone and announced each sale as though reporting election results. Mabel calculated how many jars they could produce without exhausting the remaining sound apples. Rachel tracked payments and delivery dates. Thomas, home from the hospital with his left leg still braced, sat at the kitchen table checking every contract. His hands moved more slowly than before, but his old precision had returned. Moses lay beneath his chair, occasionally placing one paw over Thomas's boot as though preventing him from disappearing again. By November 30, the gap had fallen to $1,180. Then a winter storm moved across Lake Michigan, canceling the final farmers market and delaying 2 wholesale payments. For several hours, it seemed the family would miss the deadline after coming within reach. Evelyn stood alone in the processing shed that evening, listening to sleet strike the roof. The shelves held finished apple butter, labeled cider, empty gift boxes, and Margaret Harper's blue notebook wrapped in a clean cloth. She had spent her life believing usefulness meant anticipating what everyone else needed. Now an entire operation waited for her decision, and for the first time, the wait did not make her feel invisible. It made her feel present. Shortly after 8, Rachel entered carrying her phone. Harbor Table had increased its spring order after Owen added a Harper cider glaze to the restaurant's winter menu. Priya Shah had sold every jar delivered that week and prepaid for another wholesale shipment. The combined payments covered the remaining balance with $86 to spare. June cried. Mabel sat down without speaking. Thomas removed his glasses and pressed 2 fingers against his eyes. Evelyn looked at Rachel's screen, then recalculated the totals by hand because triumph, like grief, sometimes required proof. At 8:30 the next morning, December 1, Evelyn and Thomas entered Cedar Hollow Community Bank. Thomas moved carefully on crutches, wearing his brown orchard jacket over a white shirt. Evelyn carried a folder containing the loan statement, receipts, contracts, and confirmation of every cleared payment. The branch manager, Calvin Rowe, was a 58-year-old black man with a neat salt and pepper beard, broad hands, and a reserved manner shaped by 30 years of delivering both good and terrible financial news. Calvin had known the Harper family for years, but he did not pretend friendship could erase a signed obligation. He reviewed the account twice, entered the final payment, and printed a receipt showing the required $40,000 had been satisfied. "The foreclosure action will not proceed," he said. Thomas lowered his head. Evelyn remained still until Calvin slid the stamped document across the desk. Only then did she exhale. Outside, light snow had begun to fall over Cedar Hollow. Thomas looked toward the road leading back to the orchard. "We kept it," he said. Evelyn folded the receipt into her coat pocket. "We earned it," she corrected gently. The state investigation continued through winter. Auditors compared Blackwood's scales, grading reports, grower settlements, and processor invoices across several seasons. Their final report found repeated failures to document grade changes, improper weight deductions, inaccurate grower payments, and resale of fruit at values inconsistent with the amounts reported to farmers. Curtis Blackwood denied personally ordering every alteration, and the evidence did not prove he had created the anonymous health complaint or social media post. But as owner, he had benefited from the system, ignored warnings from Luis, and allowed practices that harmed the growers who depended on him. Blackwood Packing House was required to compensate affected farms, install independently monitored scales, and create a transparent appeals process for grading disputes. Several major buyers demanded new management as a condition of continuing business. Curtis stepped down before the next harvest. He was not dragged away in handcuffs, nor did he confess beside a courthouse staircase. He simply lost the authority he had mistaken for permanence. For years, Curtis had believed the system could not be wrong because it had always worked for him. That belief cost him the trust on which his business had been built. The Harper family did not become wealthy overnight. Their compensation from Blackwood helped reduce remaining debt, but Evelyn continued expanding slowly. Harper's second harvest became a cooperative processing facility for small orchards that could not afford presses, pasteurizing equipment, or licensed storage. Growers paid transparent processing fees and retained ownership of their products. June became the seasonal sales coordinator, a title she printed on business cards large enough to frighten the mailman. Mabel supervised production and trained new workers in sanitation and temperature control. Several older women from the church joined them during harvest months, earning wages from skills they had practiced in kitchens for decades without anyone calling those skills professional. Thomas returned to light orchard work the following spring. He no longer climbed ladders alone, and Moses followed him even more closely than before. When visitors asked about the roadside stand, Thomas stopped calling it Evelyn's cider project. "That building," he said, pointing toward the expanded shed, "is the future of Harper Orchard." In May, the trees across the south parcel filled with white blossoms. Evelyn and Thomas sat on the farmhouse porch beneath a mild evening sky. Thomas's leg had healed, though he still used a cane on uneven ground. Moses lay between their chairs, his silver muzzle resting across his front paws, while petals drifted onto his black and tan coat. "I should have seen what you could do," Thomas said. Evelyn watched the orchard move gently in the wind. "You saw what I did every day. You just did not think it counted." "That is worse." "Yes," she said, though there was no cruelty in it. Thomas was quiet for a long time. "I am sorry it took me 40 years. Evelyn reached down and brushed a blossom from Moses's bent ear. "I did not suddenly become capable at 67. I simply stopped hiding everything I knew inside the house." Footsteps sounded along the porch. A new seasonal worker named Sophie Bennett approached carrying a spiral notebook. Sophie was 22, tall and freckled, with curly red hair tied beneath a green bandana and the restless energy of someone who had more ideas than confidence. She had grown up on a struggling dairy farm outside town and studied environmental agriculture at community college. During her first weeks at the facility, she had noticed how much apple pulp remained after pressing. "I think the pomace could be composted with manure from local farms," Sophie said. "Maybe part of it could also be dried for livestock feed, depending on testing. I made some estimates." She hesitated, perhaps expecting to be told she was too young, too inexperienced, or standing in the wrong place. Evelyn looked at the notebook. Then she looked at Thomas, who smiled faintly and moved his cane aside. Evelyn pulled the empty chair closer. "Show me your numbers." Beyond the porch, apple blossoms fell through the evening light like the first quiet snow of another season. The fruit Blackwood once called waste had never lacked value. Neither had the woman who learned how to save it. Both had simply waited for someone brave enough to look again. This story teaches us that a person's worth does not disappear simply because others have grown used to overlooking it. For decades, Evelyn's work in the kitchen, her careful budgeting, her patience, and her devotion were treated as ordinary. Yet when her family faced losing everything, those ordinary skills became the very tools that saved the orchard. The greatest lesson is that quiet experience can be more powerful than titles, degrees, or public praise. Skills built through years of love, sacrifice, and persistence are never wasted, even when no one applauds them. The story also reminds us to believe in our own value before waiting for others to recognize it. Miracles do not always arrive through something dramatic. Sometimes they grow from small acts repeated faithfully over many years. Evelyn did not become capable at 67. She simply stopped hiding the strength she had carried all along.